Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar, Dodging the B2B Bear Trap, Tips for Protecting the Integrity of Your B2B Research. I'm Chris Kortrid-Keeler from Innovate MR. Innovate is a globally owned sample firm which specializes in consumer and B2B sample. In the past year, we've completed thousands of B2B projects and are a leading provider in the space. Joining me today are two of our resident B2B experts, Lisa Wilding-Brown and Chris Young. Lisa Wilding-Brown is our Chief Research Officer at Innovate MR. As a 16-year veteran, Lisa is responsible for research on research, quality best practices, and sampling methodologies. She has presented at a wealth of industry conferences and contributed to trade publications such as Green Book, Wire, and the GRBN. Lisa has published research on engagement, survey design quality, and mobile best practices. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you, Chris. Glad to be here. Excited.
Thanks, Lisa. Also joining us today is Chris Young, our Senior Director of Client Development at Innovate. Chris is responsible for identifying new opportunities and consulting with clients on research campaigns and initiatives. B2B research generates over 70% of Chris's book of business, and he has conducted over 3,000 B2B studies ranging across a wide audience of professionals. Chris started his career in the market research industry in 2012. Starting in an operations role and later moving on to a project director role, Chris has a vast amount of experience in programming, sample design, survey quality management, tabulation, and reporting. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Looking forward to chatting with you and Lisa today.
Great, me too. So you guys are both very involved in B2B research, and I know this is something that Innovate has invested in heavily over the past 18 months especially. With B2B professionals in such high demand across the research space, how does the overall landscape look from your perspective? Chris, would you like to tell us how things are looking from your point of view?
Yeah, so I mean, primarily, not only has B2B research expanded as far as a research aspect and objective for a lot of clients today, but global expansion has grown as well. I'd say probably 2 or 3 years ago, 80% of our work was being conducted in North America, primarily just in the US and Canada. Whereas today, there's a lot more research being done in some of the emerging markets and even some of the more developed markets across APAC and EU. So, I think that that's the biggest area of focus, not only for B2B research, but as research as a whole. But specifically speaking on, B2B audiences that I'm starting to see more research conducted among, it's definitely going to be led by the tech sector. Probably 2 or 3 years ago, a lot of research was being primarily done by your small business owners, your HR decision makers, but a lot of research is being done by more tech-focused functions. So that's specifically going to be focused around your IT decision makers and even expanding more into developers and engineers. So yeah, those are two of the biggest factors that I've noticed as far as B2B expansion over the past few years.
So with all of these changes, what are the kind of strains and challenges that you're seeing from a supplier point of view, Chris?
I think we're all facing budget constraints. CPI compression is something that we're facing as an industry as a whole. And we all understand that B2B research is an expensive area of focus. Not only do the audiences require more resources to not only recruit and maintain and manage those respondents throughout the lifespan of them being on the panel, but also the incentives that need to be taken into account for, the respondents' participation. At a director level in my firm, I always try and put myself in the perspective of a respondent and ask myself, exactly how much would I like to earn if I was, giving my insights about my day-to-day occupation. And, I think that CPI compression changes the methodology approach as well. So, back whenever, B2B research was primarily quant focused, you're definitely starting to see a mixed mode approach, more of a hybrid approach where you're mixing qual and quant methodologies. Which is a great, if you're trying to develop a full picture of the B2B landscape. But then there's also some attributes that you have to take into account, such as PII and other details about a respondent's occupation that they may be more hesitant to provide. And so, obviously, another main topic on our space today is, the length of surveys. I know that our average internal survey is around 19.7 minutes. And if you, take that into perspective that a B2B respondent is primarily taking the survey on a mobile device and also in the workplace. 19.7 minutes is definitely on the longer side whenever you try to account for the time being spent taking the survey.
Of course, that makes sense. Definitely some things to consider. Lisa, from where you stand, what are some of the trends that you're seeing from your end in the space?
Sure, Chris. I mean, I think Chris's feedback is spot on. I think there's been a lot of intense CPI compression, which is always challenging when you're trying to engage respondents in the B2B space because they do demand a higher incentive for participation. And I think, Chris brought up another point that I just want to further reinforce around capturing personally identifiable information. I think, we've done webinars on this as it relates to data privacy and some of the upcoming legislation that's going to be coming out here in the US, specifically in California with the CCPA, and other states are surely going to follow suit. There is this overwhelming appetite for PII. And that's not going away. That's actually increasing at a pretty exponential rate, in my opinion. I think a lot of the requests that we get for both consumer and B2B, we're seeing quite a few requests to include first name, last name, address fields, state and zip, for whether it's classification, segmentation, or further data validation. But we really have to maintain a healthy balance. And when it comes to collecting PII among B2B professionals, we really do push back. Number one, it isn't fully compliant with our privacy policy. We have a really specific contract with our panelists, and we're very, very careful when we collect PII and who we share that PII with. And obviously we've seen in the news, it's been widely publicized, different companies delving into that PII space and getting into trouble. And so we're really, really careful and very conservative. And I know that our panelists respect that and appreciate that, because often we're asking them questions that are, pretty specific around their workplace and their attitudes around their profession, the actual facility they work in, the tools that they're using. And so they want to remain anonymous in most cases. And so we really try to uphold that. So I think that's going to be a continuing trend in our space, Chris. And I think kind of a third piece to this is around quality. So anytime you offer an incentive to do anything online, whether it's to participate in a survey or an offer or watch content or watch a video, whatever it may be, if there's an incentive involved, you immediately get into the crosshairs of those users online that are sophisticated, that maybe have more malicious intent, and seek to get that reward and produce it at a scale that makes sense for them from a monetary perspective. And so we do see B2B research as a high target for survey fraud and cyber fraud in general, which is pacing to be about a $6 trillion issue globally by 2021, according to Forbes magazine. So cyber fraud is definitely on the rise. And we know that there are certain types of research projects and audiences specifically that do have a tendency to have a target on their back because of those high incentives. And so I think as folks in the audience are listening to our discussion today, they really should think about quality as an overall spectrum. There's lots and lots of layers that need to be included in order to mitigate those risks associated with this particular audience, and to ensure that as a researcher, you are getting to the right individual, the person or people that have that expertise that you're looking for, so that you can ultimately deliver the insights to your client that are accurate and meaningful and help to drive business change. And I think the last piece, and Chris, you touched on it a little bit around B2B usage, mobile usage specifically, but survey design is something that I think is really, really critical for us to think about. When I first started my career back in the early 2000s, we spent months and months as new researchers learning how to develop questionnaires and design best practices around survey design and questionnaire development. And I think fast forward all those years later, there's an insurgence of DIY and survey authoring that's done by all different people, even outside of our industry. And so there's more questionnaires out there that make me, quite honestly, cringe. There's things like yes, no questions or super long attribute lists that are really cumbersome and create a lot of burden and fatigue on behalf of the respondent. And so I just would like to remind those folks in our audience today to constantly be thinking about survey design and how to optimize the design and the experience that participants are having, because it is so critical, and it absolutely does contribute to whether or not the insights that you deliver are high quality or unfortunately are not high quality. It is very much driven not only by the sample and kind of the objectives of the research, but ultimately how you design that questionnaire and capture that data.
Thanks, Lisa. That definitely makes sense. So based on what you're seeing today, what are some of the respondent considerations we should be keeping in mind for this type of research, particularly among these B2B audiences?
Sure, I can jump in here, Chris. I think, like I said before, quality is obviously paramount. There are a lot of traps that you can fall into along the way, and it starts with how you procure and vet the sample provider that you're working with. I think asking questions like, are you Microsoft certified? Have you gone through that very rigorous process to become vetted and approved by Microsoft? I think that's something that is very critical and very important for those that are participating in B2B research, because there is this very high level of rigor that's required to go through that process. I think also understanding what are the various layers that your sample provider has implemented. And it shouldn't just be, at the pre-survey level. It should really be across the entire lifetime or lifespan of a panelist. So that starts with how you're vetting the different recruitment partners that feed into your panel. What does that registration process look like? What does the pre-survey process look like? And what are some ongoing longitudinal measures that you're implementing to really mitigate the risk that is associated with this highly targeted type of research that we know for a fact fraudsters online are in fact targeting. So I think those are some important pieces to take into account, is essentially how you're vetting that sample provider. And we'll talk a little bit more on that in the next slide, on what I mean specifically about implementing a multi-layered approach. But I think as well as when you're talking with sample providers is understanding what those recruitment channels look like. And I always go back to this sort of analogy of, it's a little bit of a kind of a pop culture analogy, but if you think about the original Ghostbusters, they had a line in there where it said, don't ever cross the streams. And I actually believe that that is a great analogy for B2B versus consumer research. So we know that there's a lot of large scale panels out there and providers of sample that leverage multiple sources of sample to deliver against B2B studies. And a lot of them, what they're doing is they're recruiting from consumer panels or river-based samples, intercept samples online, or even large-scale marketplaces. And they're presenting a short battery of B2B-related questions and hoping that those consumers actually do qualify as B2B respondents. And it's a very dangerous strategy, because what you have happen is you have folks that are pretending to be something that they're not, with the aim of getting that incentive. Even if they're not doing this on a wide, sophisticated scale like a fraudster, there are still individual panel members out there that are exceptionally overzealous in participating. Some have referred to them as professional survey respondents, right? And so you have to have methods in place to mitigate the risk associated with those, not just those that are most sophisticated or doing this, out of their basement or out of some click farm in Asia or Venezuela or wherever they may be doing their operations. There's all different types and permutations of risk. And so you have to have different solutions for each of those different scenarios. And I think as a first step, working with an exclusively B2B panel is important. So, for example, when we're recruiting into our panel, we have two separate panel entities, one for consumers and one for B2B professionals. And then we use different recruitment sources. So we may work with affiliate publishers to drive traffic into a consumer-based panel, but for a B2B audience, you really want to go to very specific content sites where business professionals are hanging out, like TechCrunch or CNN Money or Forbes. The list goes on, but these are places where we know business professionals are hanging out and engaging with the content, and therefore more likely to qualify for the type of survey inventory that we host for our clients. So I'll get more into the quality layers in the next slide, Chris, but I'll pass it to Chris to speak on as well as it relates to respondent considerations.
Yeah, Lisa, those are all great points about survey design. I think that the biggest factor whenever you're doing your B2B research is understanding, when and where and how the B2B respondent is taking the survey. So making sure that, you're layering in all of those different questions with your mobile optimization to making sure that it's rendering well on your mobile device is so important, because we do know that the majority of B2B surveys are taken during the workplace. Whenever the respondent is actually at their job, that's whenever they're providing their insights. It's kind of a bonus strategy, I guess, but it's the nature of B2B research. And so asking your sample provider, when are you sending out your sample batches? I mean, are you sending them at 10 a.m. whenever we know that there's a higher concentration of B2B professionals who are at their desk and are able to take surveys, or are you sending out survey opportunities at 7 p.m. whenever the professional is probably spending time with their family? So making sure that you're staggering your batch sends to the appropriate time lapse is definitely important as well. And then also demographics are very important to the quota balancing that you put in place. So on the B2B side, you do have your standard demographics, what is like something that you would see on your a consumer project, but we also have what are called firmographics. And firmographics are basically how you corporate structure a B2B panel. So this is going to be your organization size, the specific title of a respondent, which sector they work in. So understanding and focusing on the different ways that you're balancing your sample is important as well. Tying that in to quotas is also going to be click balancing. So click balancing is where you balance the sample by the respondents who start the survey rather than by respondents who complete the survey. So this is basically is regularly done on your market sizing projects or where you're trying to get a true read of the marketplace. And so trying to decide whether click balancing is really relevant or not during a B2B sample project is very important. As we all know, click balancing does waste sample, and with the precious assets such as a B2B respondent, we have to be aware and cognizant that whenever you are balancing, trying to put click balancing into your B2B surveys, it does waste a lot of sample.
Thanks, Chris. That's definitely some good tips. Thank you also, Lisa. Lisa, you mentioned that there were some quality practices that we should be observing. Can you share some information on what Innovate is doing in terms of B2B audience and potentially spreading over to your consumer audience as well?
Sure, yeah. So this next slide, Chris, showcases all the various layers that we have in place. So when I said earlier in the webinar that, hey, we have a lot of layers, I wasn't kidding, right? You can see here from this particular graphic that it really requires a multi-layered approach, because guess what? There is no silver bullet. No one in our space or other industries are impervious to these threats, whether it's real human beings that maybe have the wrong intentions, but are willing to participate and are acting in isolation and on their own, versus large-scale groups or collaborative networks and click farms that are really at a scaled operation to do some serious damage, not only on one panel, but maybe a multitude of panels. And so we've really always taken the stance that you've got to constantly be iterating. You have to constantly change your tactics, because the fraudsters out there are very unpredictable, right? I often liken it to a virus, right? There's new strains of computer viruses that pop up and surface every day. Cyber fraud is no different. There are new permutations, new strains that emerge every day. And so if you build out technological solutions last week to fit against a particular type of fraudulent activity, it doesn't mean that your work is done, right? You have got to continue to iterate and change your tactics so that you can be unpredictable like the fraudsters. And so it starts off with before you even engage people to join your panel. And these are all types of things that you should be asking as you start to vet different sample providers in our industry. How many recruitment campaigns are you running? What does the diversity of that mix look like? How do you maintain replicability, especially for trackers and longitudinal research, where you maybe need different respondents wave over wave, but you need to have stable sample frames to offset any concern around noise in the sample that might impact the ultimate data quality of the study. What is some benchmark testing that you're doing to assess how a source looks compared to established benchmarks that you maybe have in-house to help you gauge how a source overall looks versus what you would expect them to look. You know, what is that overall quality evaluation? I think that's step one, is really important, is to understand what's happening before respondents get into a particular panel. And then as respondents are coming into the registration path, what types of questions are they responding to? I think Chris had mentioned earlier the difference between demographics and firmographics, right? Firmographics are for B2B audiences. There's questions like organizational revenue, company size, job title, decision-making, budgetary oversight. There's a whole host of questions. And we actually align to something called Microsoft taxonomy, which is a very specific structure and way of collecting firmographic information. But aside from, you know, screening and understanding where people fit within their overall profile, there's lots of behind the scene layers that should be implemented. Things like digital fingerprinting, geo IP check and location verification, you know, even leveraging old school strategies like red herrings has been exceptionally valuable for us in our business. You know, we don't just kind of rest our laurels on basic red herring questions. Like, for example, what color is the sky, right? Like Siri on your iPhone, she's a bot and she can respond in some ways even joke with you, but certainly give you directions to the airport and tell you what today's weather forecast looks like. So she can answer pretty basic questions. And so using basic red herrings is not a good strategy. And so we've developed almost 1,000 B2B red herrings at this stage across a wide variety of different segments and decision-making groups. And we really cater those questions very specifically, and it helps us to, number one, understand if respondents are paying attention, but also number two is, are they the right respondent? Do they have the expertise to take this B2B study? So instead of asking them what color is the sky, instead we're going to ask them about their experience using CRM tools, and we're going to have real brands that make CRM tools and fake brands. And if respondents select those fake CRM brands, then we know that they're not legitimate or authentic respondents that we want in our survey. And so randomizing those on not only a project level, but actually a respondent level. So each time a respondent comes into our pre-screener, they're seeing a different red herring than the last respondent saw and the next respondent will see. And this again makes you very, very unpredictable as a panel company, and fraudsters just simply move on because you're fatiguing them out, you're changing your tactics. And I think that's something that's really important. And I think the last piece around all these different layers and technological checks is you really want something that watches people longitudinally, right? We've seen in our past lives that people have really good registration data, but maybe a month or two down the line, they start to change their responses, or the responses are inconsistent to information that they've provided previously. And certainly some things are more temporal in nature, while others are more stable, and we have a system that takes those factors into account. But certainly things like year of birth, that shouldn't change. That is a stable variable that should remain constant each and every time we reconfirm that information or ask you that information. So longitudinal being watchful of them longitudinally is really important. And then recently we just launched something around the concept of open-end text analysis, which we're doing in real time, and we present respondents with a whole host of different questions sporadically as they participate in our panel. Each of those questions are different each time, and the respondent is asked to provide a thoughtful response in the open-end text box. And in real time, we have developed an algorithm that sits behind the scenes and is able to assess the quality of that entry for things like gibberish, if it's an original thought, or if in fact it's been copied and pasted from some other source. It looks at the timestamp of the entry along with the character count. It even cross-checks for profanity. So what we're doing there is we're really trying to get high quality respondents that are highly engaged, that are participating and providing thoughtful responses. And we're doing that through a wide variety of different layers. Chris?
Great, thanks so much. So you've received some positive feedback on your approach. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we've received a ton of great feedback, and here you'll see a quote from one of our clients, Karen Bills, over at LinkedIn. We've been working with them for several years, and really received a lot of great feedback around the different quality mechanisms that we have, we do really feel like it's a strong differentiator, but something that's really, really important. I think this is something that when we started Innovate, we really wanted to pop the bubble a bit in our industry and start having very open, transparent conversations, Chris, about quality and the situation in our industry and how truly frightening it has become, right? Because I felt like as a researcher, no one was really talking about the elephant in the room. And so in the last few years, I've been attending several different conferences and speaking at those conferences to really try to open that discussion up and provide some education and visibility and ultimately transparency around cyber fraud. Because again, like I said before, there's no silver bullet. B2B research is a huge target, and it's really, really important that as you're working with different sample providers, you're getting that feedback from them on what they're doing to mitigate against some of these threats.
Obviously, it's very helpful to have the supplier kind of doing the heavy lifting at the onset, but in terms of defining your target audience from a client's point of view, how would you recommend they're setting up their survey screeners to make sure that they're perpetuating that and able to reach the right people? Do you have recommendations for that?
I do. I mean, I think your question, Chris, points to the fact that, you know, producing quality insights is not just one group, one person's responsibility. It's a truly collaborative effort, and it requires the positive contributions of many, many different parties across an entire ecosystem in our space, right? And so while we want to make sure that sample providers in our industry are leveraging the best technologies and the best methodologies to, you know, mitigate those risks, because let's be honest, the internet is a really dirty, messy place, right? There's a ton of activity, it's super dynamic, it's changing every second of every day. And at the same time, we're trying to create this stable environment where we produce stable sample frames that really point to deep insights to any given business. And that can be challenging to provide that stability within a super, super dynamic environment. And so it really requires that we hold hands with our clients and their clients. And I think the first tip around screening best practices is just don't ever assume, never assume that you have the right audience. You've got to let the screener do the heavy lifting for qualification. Avoid those yes/no questions. Avoid having introductory paragraphs around the intent and objectives of the research study, so you're not giving away too much detail to respondents. Let them do the work. And also, I think the other piece, and I know, Chris, you probably have some commentary around this, is just don't make that screening too limiting. I've seen time and time again where clients will come to us for advice on the best way to build out their screener. And I'll look at it, and at first glance, I'll see the way that they've crafted questions or response choices. They've really, in essence, painted themselves into a corner. And there's ways to open up those questions to make it a much more high qualifying study so that they can save costs, they can save time, they can get to the right audience in short order. There's just all sorts of benefit to building the correct screener and qualification path. So Chris, what are your thoughts around that? I'm curious. I know you've seen so many projects cross your desk. What are your thoughts around screeners and making sure that they're not too limiting?
Yeah, you're exactly right, Lisa. I mean, you know, some of the screeners that I see today are definitely limiting in factors of, you know, not only reaching, you know, very specific audiences, but it also affects, you know, overall feasibility. We all know that feasibility at times for B2B projects can, you know, definitely be an issue. And whenever you're limiting it to specific audiences, you know, going back to the firmographic talk, which is, you know, the corporate structure, the, you know, the title of the respondent, the organization size, you know, adding those screeners into your survey are definitely important, but at times they can be limiting. So, you know, instead of, you know, screening specifically for a specific title, for example, you know, looking for just VP plus titles or just director plus titles, you know, one way to expand your feasibility and also be able to reach the right audience would be to instead screen based on decision making or influence. I mean, that's one way to not only open up your targeting, but it also allows you to reach much larger numbers as well across sectors that may be a little bit more challenging to reach. So I think that keeping that consideration in place as far as how you're qualifying respondents based on influence, decision making, and then also keeping those firmographics in mind. Do you really need the 2,500 plus employee organizations, or are you good with 1,000 plus employee organizations which still qualify as an enterprise organization? Putting those factors into place definitely help out your screening.
Thanks, Chris. Lisa, in terms of the design of the screeners, what are some of the areas that when you see them in a questionnaire kind of make you cringe or take a step back that you think could really use some improvement?
Great question. Well, I mentioned earlier the yes/no questions. Definitely, I see a lot of those for whatever reason. I think there's just more people across more layers of an organization that have been tasked with writing and developing questionnaires. I think in those early days when we started online research, it was really kept to the most experienced, most will teach, researchers. And so you're seeing more entry-level folks developing questionnaires. And I think it's not always clear why a yes/no question isn't a good strategy. And simply put, when you have a yes/no strategy, you're making assumptions that the respondent that you're getting from your sample provider is the right respondent that will qualify for your study. And it's pretty leading. People figure it out that you're more than likely looking for the yeses. So they'll select yes and potentially get into a survey that they shouldn't be in. Some of the other things that I've seen, Chris, are still a lot of heavy grids in 2019, which is surprising given mobile penetration rates have increased dramatically over the last few years. I mean, smartphone penetration is 90% plus in most countries, developed countries, I should say. But certainly in terms of respondent traffic, we're seeing in the area of 50 to 60% of both consumer and B2B respondents coming in from a mobile device. So for many, many years, and I know some of you in the audience may have known me from my last company, where I spent a lot of time doing research around mobile research and mobile best practices. And so I have quite a bit of experience in that. And even back in like 2010, 2011, I was saying, getting on my soapbox and talking about mobile and how it was coming and how we need to be ready as an industry to change our tactics and develop shorter surveys and more simplistic question design so that it renders regardless of what the screen size may be. And here we are in 2019, and I'm still seeing a lot of grids. I mean, even earlier today, Chris and I were talking about a particular client survey, and the client wanted our advice on how she should change that. And I went through the questionnaire and definitely found several questions that make it seem like it's really not going to render well on a mobile device, and she needs to rethink how that's structured. So we made some recommendations on splitting those questions out and refining some of the attributes that she had in her response choices. And so there's definitely creative ways that you can make your survey more mobile friendly and avoid those long grids and those complex grids, because at the end of the day, if you're working with people on a mobile device, side to side scrolling is not an intuitive mobile function for a mobile user. Up and down scrolling for sure is, but side to side, pinching and zooming, we all do it on our mobile devices, but some people struggle with it more than others. And so you run the risk of having key points of your scale or key choices in an attribute list that aren't present on the screen when the respondent is interpreting the question, which is very, very dangerous and can lead to essentially non-response on some of those important attributes in your question, as an example. Or the top two box of a scale might be out of view and therefore not selected, or selected at a lower rate than what the natural population that you're looking to interview would typically indicate. So just keep that in mind. I think also, Chris, like I mentioned, we utilize a lot of red herrings to vet respondents and test their authenticity and expertise. But leveraging red herrings within your survey itself is a wonderful practice. Again, I think there are good ways of developing red herrings and there are bad ways. I've seen from time to time, say at minute 25, an intense looking grid with a tiny little instruction at code 12. Even I've missed that. So you really have to capture a fine balance between not going too easy, but also not going in a real difficult direction where you're going to lose respondents that may quite honestly already be fatigued from a fairly long study. And I think to kind of wrap up this particular slide, I would say that, quality is not captured in one question, but it's really a multi-question strategy. So if you are going to implement red herrings and different checks and traps within your survey, which I think is a very good practice, I wouldn't rely on the performance in one question, but rather multiple questions to create a picture of that particular respondent and their overall participation versus their participation at one singular question.
Thanks, Lisa. That definitely makes sense. So when you're expanding your research internationally, it feels like it adds an extra layer of complexity, especially among a B2B audience. Chris, do you have any recommendations to help ensure the success of a global project for these audiences?
Yeah, I think it's important to make sure that your firmographics are aligning to the markets that you're doing the research in. I know with a B2B focus, I know that I've always had, I've always been interested in looking outside just the market research industry, just to understand how the entire business landscape looks, looking at different sectors, looking at different organization sizes, looking at how different decision makers are, defined based on different titles. And so whenever you're looking at that in perspective to international research, I think you have to look at and primarily understand how those firmographics are balancing out on an international level. So, for example, here in the U.S., where we have more of a structured title approach, where we have your director titles, you have your VP titles, your SVP, all the way up to C-suite. Outside of U.S. and U.K., I know that markets such as India, they have more of a hierarchical structure, so it's more of a head of department or a leading manager of, or a specific, one guy manages an entire team. So keeping that in mind is very important. Also, company size is something that you have to keep in mind. I know that a lot of research here in the U.S., 1,000+ employee organizations is, regularly defined as an enterprise organization. But whenever you put that into comparison to smaller markets, more emerging markets, that enterprise qualification may only be 250+ employee organization. So whenever you're trying to align, if you are doing international research, and especially when you're tying that to U.S. research, I think it's important to make sure that you're keeping everything in line as far as the corporate firmographic structure. Translations are something I can't speak on enough. It's still kind of crazy that I get requests for international research, and the survey is only offered in English only. Whenever you look up the data, I think that was the eye opener for me whenever I was fully convinced that translations are worth the money. But it's whenever you put it into perspective against percentages. So if you look at an international market, if a specific market only has 30% of English usage, you're cutting out a pretty good representation of the overall market. And so, whenever you're looking to conduct your research projects, I definitely suggest making sure that you're budgeting in those translation costs. And then lastly, just, going back to how you're defining different organization sizes, the different titles, you have to make sure that whenever you're looking at an organization with 100 million plus revenue in the U.S., that's definitely not in comparison to the Netherlands. This isn't apples to apples comparison. So keeping in mind whenever you're developing and defining those different quotas and defining, the screening qualifications for, especially metric firmographics, something that can actually be measurable, like organization size, is something that you need to keep in mind.
Thanks, Chris. That definitely makes sense. So Lisa, bouncing back to the sample provider space, what are some things that you would suggest asking the sample provider to make sure you're getting kind of that high quality audience that you're after?
Sure, Chris. So I know we've covered much of this in the webinar so far, but just as a recap before we close the loop on this and put a bow tie on it here, I think the first question here is, how is your B2B panel vetted and recruited? We talked a lot about not crossing the streams, Ghostbuster style, right? Making sure that you're using a B2B focused panel where the intention is to engage B2B professionals from B2B focused sources and content-based sites online, that there's ample and proper vetting that's occurring as they register. So understanding what the specific information is that's being collected among that B2B audience is critical. Third is how does that incentivization structure look like? Is it a threshold model, or is it a direct cash incentive that's issued every single survey they participate in? I always recommend more of a threshold approach because it really helps to demonstrate long-term loyalty and commitment. It helps to deter those that are seeking instant gratification, as well as deter those fraudsters online that definitely have B2B research in their crosshairs. Fourth question is, what mechanisms are in place to mitigate poor quality? Again, we talked about there's no silver bullet, there's no fix here. This is a $6 trillion issue globally speaking. You know, our industry is just one of many that's affected day in and day out by these nefarious users online. And so really having a multi-layered approach that's iterative, that's changing, that's dynamic is super important to try to stay up to speed with these fraudsters. Certainly, what has been your experience with B2B audiences in the particular market that you're looking to focus your research in? I mean, I think from talking with Chris here, it's really clear that he's run a multitude of different studies across many, many different geographies and markets. And what's good for the US isn't good for the Netherlands, right? There's change among each of those different markets, and you need to work with an expert that's done that research, that understands the nuances of those geos so that you can put your best foot forward. And I think the last one that's really important is your provider Microsoft certified? I mean, it's not a new concept. Microsoft certification's been around for years and years, but certainly I think it does help to separate those that are true experts in B2B research and those that are selling consumer sample, you know, but presented as B2B respondents, which we know is certainly not the case. So those are just at a high level some key questions that I, you know, with my experience having both been a sample buyer and now a person that provides sample to the industry, I've worn both hats and been on both sides of the fence. I think these are the key questions to ask sample providers as you start to assess you know, who you want to work with in the future.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa and Chris, and everyone for joining us. We hope this information was helpful. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at info@innovatemr.com. And have a great day.
Thanks, Chris. You guys take care.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Chris.